Gillian, thank you so much for joining us here at Super Return International.
It's great to be here.
You've spent time today talking about the rise in populism that we've seen and how it's actually at a different stage in the terms of the economic cycle this time around. Explain that for me and what you think that could mean.
Well, I find it truly fascinating to look at politics these days, which is not something that investors used to obsess about, but something very odd is going on, which is that we've seen since 2010 an explosion in the amount of populism in the Western world. Bridgewater hedge fund calculates that 35% of the vote now is going to populist candidates, up from around 10% at the start of the decade. And although we've seen that swing occur before in history, it's always occurred in recessions, depressions, whereas this time around we've seen populism explode during a period of economic growth. So it begs the question, if populism has risen this high in good times, what on earth is going to happen in bad times? And what does that mean for policy making and where it's heading?
So what you're saying is that financial institutions that in the past haven't perhaps looked at politics as much now need to be doing that and shaping their strategies around that.
Well, I think the key point is that nobody can assume that the political economy is going to carry on working in the same way that we saw in the post-war years of the 20th century, that actually political culture matters, that actually expectations and assumptions can change very fast. And at the moment, we're seeing the global economy continuing to grow. In spite of all the rhetoric about protectionism, we're still seeing plenty of trade happening. The central banks appear to have a fairly carefully crafted policy which they're unveiling or implementing. But the question is, going forward, can we presume that we won't see populism impeding more and more on policy making and creating some really nasty surprises?
You've talked about how populism has come about partly because of a fragmented society, if you like, due to communication changing and what people's expectations are of what they can do in terms of making every product they own or have suit them. And that's now sort of seeping into finance too.
We're increasingly seeing a world where voters are increasingly congregating into quite tribal groups online. Ironically, the internet has intensified tribalism, not reduced it. We're seeing a world where trust in traditional institutions is fragmenting. Doesn't mean there's no trust at all. People are trusting their peer group, but it's definitely changing and people are looking to their peers for advice. We're seeking a world where people are essentially having pick and mix politics, where they're essentially having a pick and mix consumer culture in other parts of their lives, and they're increasingly pick and mixing their political ideas, going for brands and single issues. And when you add that together, that's quite a volatile mix and potentially quite unpredictable. And it's also the perfect breeding ground, unfortunately, for more populism.
With all of that in mind, do finance companies need to look more at how they present themselves to the public now? Because you talked about people not trusting institutions in the same way. So does strategy need to change? Do they need to concentrate more on things like ESG and socially responsible investing?
I think that the message for financial companies really is twofold. Firstly, they absolutely need to recognise that their employees are likely to be sourced for information about the company as much as the CEO. And the old days of assuming that the CEO said something and everyone believed it are simply over. Secondly, they need to recognise that the idea that capitalism is self-evidently a good thing, that free market forces are loved by everyone, that's also increasingly coming under attack. And so thinking about how businesses of all stripe, including private equity, interact with wider society in this changing climate is going to be very important.
They need to look at how they look to the general public and their public perception, plays out now.
I think that private equity companies definitely need to think about how their image is being shaped, recognise that it may not be shaped entirely by themselves, and to think about how they're interacting with society, because an era when people are feeling angry and looking for targets is an era when people can become targets very easily without expecting to have that.
So a lot of instability and unpredictability, but this is also at a time when there's great disruption from things like tech too.
There's a huge amount of opportunity right now for investors, and there's a huge amount of opportunity for anyone who's able to develop new business models, because it is a time of great fluidity.
So on an optimistic note as well, there is opportunity out there.
Well, on an optimistic note, you're seeing essentially populism is simply another way of saying you're having political disruption at a time of great economic disruption. So if you're savvy, you can definitely play this market well and look for the opportunities.
You've been great at predicting and analysing financial crises in the past. So what are people asking you now, and where are we at in terms of the cycle? Because there's a lot of talk about recession coming.
A lot of talk about recession coming. I don't think it will come this year, but probably next, but who knows. People are looking at a lot of populism, how that may impede. The short-term issue is trade wars and whether that's going to crimp growth. But of course the other issue that people are looking a lot at is climate change and how that may change our perception and presumptions about what's going to happen next.
And something like the PE world could really be at the fore of investing in renewables and an area like that, and it could also help reputation perhaps.
I think the private equity would do very well to look seriously at climate change issues, both so that they have a positive message to unveil, but also because as climate change pressures build, there's going to be a real need to develop technologies, and somebody needs to fund that and finance it and develop it.
Gillian, it's fascinating to hear your insights. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you.